Okay. It's one of those things, right? Everyone's got an opinion on it. And I gotta say, going through the research you sent me for this deep dive, some of the stuff I was like, whoa, I did not know that. It's a lot more complicated than I think a lot of people realize.
It is. It's a long history. And it's, it's something that, when you think about other ideologies, there are certain kind of like set rules or like
Right.
parameters. And
Yeah.
feminism is really about understanding how gender shapes our world and how we can address that.
So where do we even begin with something like that? I mean, where's the starting point? We've made progress with laws, but have we really dismantled those deeper societal
Expectations about what a woman should be.
It's a really good question. Like, I don't know if we have an answer to that.
And that question leads us to all these different schools of thought within feminism, because they're all trying to figure out, how do we actually create a more just and equal world?
So we're moving from like the crashing waves of history into these more nuanced
Currents of feminist ideologies.
Exactly.
So we've got these different schools of thought within feminism
each with their own
take on how to actually address these inequalities.
Right.
Where do we even start?
Well, a helpful way to think about it is it's like branches on a tree, right? They all share that common root. They're all about gender equality, but they grow in different directions. They offer different perspectives, different solutions.
Which branch are we climbing up first?
Let's start with liberal feminism,
Okay.
because that's probably one of the more commonly understood ones.
Okay.
And basically, it's all about individual rights, equal opportunities. It works within the system, believes that change can happen on that existing playing field.
It's about making sure that everyone has an equal shot at success.
Exactly.
No matter their gender.
Yeah. Dismantling those discriminatory laws, fighting for equal pay, making sure everyone has access to education, healthcare, all of that.
Right. Like level the playing field.
Exactly.
Then there's that argument that even if you level the playing field, the whole game itself is rigged.
Yeah, and that's where you get into socialist feminism, because they're digging a little deeper.
Right.
They're saying that gender inequality, it's woven into capitalism itself. Like, you got to look at the whole economic system, and to understand that, you kind of got to go back to Marx and Engels and how they looked at those power imbalances within capitalism.
So it's not just about individual opportunities, but the whole system is messed up.
They say that when you have a system that's all about profit, competition, it inherently devalues things that are seen as feminine, like caregiving, domestic work.
Which is often unpaid.
Exactly. Or underpaid.
Yeah.
It's all that like invisible labor.
Yeah, it's like essential to society, but nobody wants to pay for it.
No, think about all the hours women spend on childcare, housework, emotional labor, all that stuff. It's essential. But it's not valued in the same way under capitalism.
Such a good point.
It's invisible.
It is invisible. We've got liberal feminism kind of working within the system.
Socialist feminism saying, no, the whole system's messed up, and then...
Where does that leave radical feminism? Because they always seem to be the one, like...
ripping headlines.
Radical feminism is where things get really, really interesting, because they're questioning those fundamental assumptions about gender, about power, to get to true liberation.
You got to dismantle these patriarchal structures that are causing all these problems.
So it's like a whole new game.
A whole new game.
Okay, wow.
And even within radical feminism, equality feminists, sometimes called androgynous feminists, want to deconstruct this whole gender binary. They're saying these categories, male, female, all the traits we associate with them, it's all made up. It's not necessarily bunk, but it's a social construct. And they draw a lot on the work of Judith Butler, who's this like huge figure in gender theory. She talks about gender performativity.
Gender performativity. All right. That's a mouthful. You're going to have to break that down for me.
So basically what Butler's saying is that gender isn't something you are, it's something you do. It's a performance. Like, we're all on a stage. It's all these behaviors, expressions that we learn and often unconsciously repeat throughout our lives.
So instead of there being some male way of being or female way of being, we're just acting out these roles that society tells us to.
And because these roles are constructed, they're not from birth. That means we can break free from them. We can create a society where gender isn't this rigid, hierarchical thing.
Okay, so that's pretty radical.
It is.
But then you've got difference feminism, which you said is like a...
Yeah, now this is where it gets interesting because it challenges some of those core liberal ideas about equality.
Really?
Yeah.
How so?
So unlike equality feminists who want to get rid of the binary altogether,
Right.
difference feminists are like, no, men and women are fundamentally different.
Yeah.
And they say these differences rooted in biology, psychology, whatever it might be.
We should acknowledge them, celebrate them. Don't erase them in the name of some artificial sameness. Embrace the differences. But this is where it gets a little controversial because some feminists, they argue for separate spaces, even like female superiority, which obviously, clashes with some of those core tenets of like equal is equal.
It sounds like we're getting into some really complex
and potentially like really, really controversial territory here, especially when we start to think about like how these different perspectives actually play out in the real. Okay, so how does it play out? Like when we're talking about trans rights, how do those different feminist views
kind of come down on this?
So you've got, on the one hand, you've got trans-inclusive feminists, and they're saying, look, gender identity, it's fluid, right? It's distinct from biological sex. So trans women are women, trans men are men. And to exclude trans people from feminist spaces.
Or to deny their gender identity. That goes against the very heart of what feminism is about.
So for them, it's about expanding that definition of womanhood to include trans women. It's about breaking down those categories. They see the fight for trans rights as a continuation of the fight for women's rights.
But then you've got the gender-critical feminists who have a very different view.
Because they still see themselves as feminists, right? They're advocating for women's rights.
Right.
But they have concerns about what happens when you kind of blur those lines between sex and gender identity.
Right.
They say, look, sex is real, right? It has consequences, and you can't just erase that.
And they're concerned about, like, trans women in sports. They say, look, there might be some biological advantages there.
Right. It is. The most important thing is that we approach these conversations
with nuance.
Right.
With respect, recognizing that people have very real concerns on both sides of this.
It's not about shutting down the conversation.
Oh, no. It's about dialogue.
Yeah.
And that kind of leads us to another important idea in feminism today, which is intersectionality.
People don't experience oppression in, like, a vacuum.
Right.
We all have multiple identities, race, class, gender identity, sexual orientation, ability. All these things overlap.
They intersect.
And that creates, like, really unique experiences of both privilege and disadvantage.
So it's not just enough to say, like, I'm a woman, this is my experience, because your experience as a woman is going to be different if you're a Black woman or if you're a white woman. All these other factors come into play.
And what intersectionality does is it says, we need to look at all of that.
Okay.
We move beyond these single issue frameworks and see how these things connect, how they reinforce each other.
It makes me think about those early suffragettes.
Yeah.
They were fighting for women's right to vote, but their views on race were
flawed, to say the least.
Totally. And that's what intersectionality pushes us to do, is to look at those blind spots. To say, okay, even within a movement that's fighting for equality,
there can still be hierarchy, there can still be exclusion. It's about centering the voices of those who are most marginalized, who are experiencing multiple forms of oppression at the same time. We've covered a lot. We've gone from the early suffragettes
to the complexities of trans rights.
And intersectionality.
Feminism is not just like this one thing. It's a movement.
It's a dynamic.
Constantly evolving. There's like debate. There's dissent.
That's what's exciting about it.
Yeah, totally.
It's not about just memorizing a bunch of rules. It's about constantly being in this dialogue, questioning your assumptions. And really trying to create a world that's more just and equal for everyone.
I love it.
I think the biggest thing is, remember, feminism is not a spectator sport, right? You got to get in the game, you got to learn, you got to engage, ask questions, challenge yourself. Feminism, it's not just about women. It's about creating a more just world for all genders. It's about challenging toxic masculinity as much as dismantling the patriarchy.
It's about realizing that equality benefits everyone.
We hope this has sparked your curiosity, maybe challenged some assumptions.
Maybe even inspire you to join the conversation.
Until next time, keep those brains buzzing.